Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would sit down and do another video for you guys and gals. Let me give you guys a forearm shot before we get started. All right, forearms are on point. I had someone try to argue with me in the comments, and they jumped up and said, you need to educate yourself. Well, you picked the wrong person for that. Because don't you know, because I was talking about saturated fat, that the dietary cholesterol and cardiovascular disease myth has been debunked. Of course it has. What does that have to do with anything I talk about on this channel? That is the problem. You find this whole area, these people who have this pro-red meat, pro-saturated fat, oh, we live on nothing but red meat and eggs, and butter. These people don't seem to know basic nutrition, basic biology, or even how science works. They're not educated. They're not educated. And you can tell whenever they bring up the cholesterol thing. Yes, that has been debunked, but that is not what we're talking about. We're not even talking about dietary cholesterol. Okay, what we're talking about is saturated fat. Those are two very separate things. Yes, there can be a lot of overlap. Now, keep in mind, the old data that even raised the cholesterol myth was the Ansel Keys 7-nation study conducted like 50 years ago. We can argue about the quality of the research there. Granted, it was purely correlational data, epidemiology, and the countries were a little cherry-picked. Okay, this makes it a bit problematic. So no one is standing here saying, well, that study still holds and yes, the dietary cholesterol is a full problem. No, dietary cholesterol isn't always linked with blood cholesterol, right? Only in certain individuals with certain genetic predispositions can it be. It's not the majority of people. But what is a problem is LDL cholesterol absolutely causes atherosclerosis. This has been pretty well confirmed in the research. We also know that saturated fat elevates LDL cholesterol. The amount varies from person to person based upon genetics, but there is a direct relationship. And there's a direct causation. Now, here's the issue with that. Yes, there's going to be overlaps of foods, but here's the problem. This changes the food sources. Why? Because there are foods that have nearly zero saturated fat that have a fair amount of cholesterol in them, right? So it's kind of important to know this. There are also plant sources of saturated fat that have zero cholesterol in them. Okay, that's why it's important to make this distinction, because when people say, oh, well, the cholesterol is the issue, so I can eat this or that in copious amounts and it's not going to affect me long-term in terms of cardiovascular risk. Well, I'm sorry, the evidence does not support that. The evidence supports that the dietary cholesterol doesn't necessarily raise LDL-C. Okay, and we know that LDL-C absolutely causes cardiovascular disease over an extended period of time. So we need to know these things, and I'll give you some examples. And why it was correlational, because yes, people who eat large amounts of red meat tend to get cardiovascular disease, but it's not because it has cholesterol in it. It's because it's high in saturated fat. All right, examples of foods that have cholesterol with nearly zero or zero saturated fat. Egg whites, fat-free dairy, right there. Skim milk, fat-free Greek yogurt, egg whites, perfect examples of foods that have cholesterol in them, that have nearly zero saturated fat, that don't negatively affect your lipids even when consumed in large amounts. Even lean chicken breasts, lean turkey breasts up there too. They're a little more fat than the others, obviously, but it's still very small. These are not associated with cardiovascular risk in spite of having cholesterol. Give an example of a zero cholesterol food. Palm oil, absolutely correlated with negative health outcomes. Insulin resistance, elevated bad cholesterol, palm oil, perfect example. Shouldn't eat it if you care about your heart. Has zero cholesterol. So what's the real factor here? Well, the saturated fat. So when you look at that and you say, well, because the dietary cholesterol isn't associated, well, there is a correlation because a lot of the foods that have a lot of one do have a lot of the other. See, but where are foods that are exclusively one or the other? Red meat, fatty red meat of any type, I don't care whether it's beef or pork. Eggs in large amounts, obviously, butter, these things have both. And the saturated fat of dairy tends to vary upon the form it's in as far as it elevating LDL. That's been known. So when people look at this, they're not understanding that you do need to be concerned with saturated fat and the source of that saturated fat, right? So in other words, we come over and find that whole milk dairy doesn't have that much of a negative effect, but butter does once it's been partitioned out. So if you had to compare it, obviously the palm oil, which is a plant-based, seems to be considerably worse than, say, whole milk or whole fat dairy for that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. But the other foods, it's not. The other foods are just as bad. Fatty red meat, problem. Eggs, when you start consuming enough, the saturated fat content accumulates. Eggs have certain health benefits in small amounts. That's why in a small amount we're not as concerned, because some of the choline, or choline, however we pronounce it, things like that can have certain cardioprotective benefits, right? There are potential things there that are helpful. So in trace amounts, eggs aren't really bad, but you start eating, 10 a day, they can be, absolutely negatively affect your blood work and your long-term cardiovascular risk. It's kind of important to know these things, but this is no longer correlational data we have studied in the lab, and we know, and I say we, the human race, people say, who's we? You don't do the studies. Talking about the human species and scientists around the world collectively, we know, based upon the data, both epidemiology and direct metabolic ward controlled studies, controlled clinical trials, that when significant amounts of saturated fat are consumed, they cause insulin resistance, causes fatty liver, and it causes elevated LDL. And elevated LDL is the direct cause of atherosclerosis in humans. Okay, this is pretty well established and shown in controlled studies. So does that mean that refined sugars aren't bad too? Yes, of course they are. So we come over to the point of people will say they try to blame one or the other. That's where they mess up. Why don't we accept that the data clearly shows that large amounts of saturated fat cause insulin resistance and all sorts of lipid problems? Large amounts of refined fructose, aka table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and to some extent honey, right, cause metabolic benefits, insulin resistance, fatty liver. When you accept that both cause it, people say, well, I took one out and my blood work improved. Well, of course it did. If you have two things that are bad for you and you reduce one of them, will you see potentially an improvement? Yeah, that's common sense. But if you reduce both of them, it's even better. See how that works? But people, they can't see the forest for the trees, and they're not looking at what the problems here are. And so then you run into the same issue. They bring up, well, the dietary cholesterol. Yeah, you're right. But that doesn't mean that the saturated fat is fine. It's just that the cholesterol content of the food probably isn't an issue for the majority of the population. But the saturated fat is, just like the refined fructose is. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative. I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.